6. In the long distant past, the world was split into the forest elven kingdom Kela and the dark elven kingdom of Lysulia. The human alliance of the Nine, the underground realm of the dwarves, and various other groupings along racial lines. And while there were skirmishes, at times the land was at peace. But one day, something happened, and 100 varied regions from around the world were cut into circles from the earth and summoned to the sky. The circles were under 2 miles across at the smallest and over 6 miles at the largest. They were stacked in a conical formation to form a giant floating fortress 100 floors tall. This castle held its countless towns, villages, mountains, forests, and lakes, and never again returned to Earth. The magic powers that caused the old civilization to flourish were lost, and with them the 9 kingdoms of man. Most towns reverted to maintaining themselves, and the floors lost contact with one another. A great length of time passed. Legends and tales of great separation still existed among the 2 elf races, the only people in their kingdoms intact from that fateful time. And that's how the story goes, I said. Summarized the backstory of Einkrad's genesis as best I'd learn it at that day while I leaned back against the tent. A watery voice answered from my behind. So it feels like we learned some stuff, but none of it was very useful. Pretty much, I replied, looking up with my hands folded behind my head. Beyond the steam issuing from the exhaust pipe built into the roof of the bathroom tent, the bottom of the 4th floor gleamed dark and foreboding. According to the elf legend, someone had yanked the ground straight out of the earth and connected it with the framework of a steel and stone, so that the pieces were stacked atop of each other. Of course, the true creators of SAO were Kayaba and Argus Staff, and the legends of the Great Separation were nothing but background info they added to the game. But it was hard not to be curious about it all. Who had created this floating castle and why? Was it the whim of the godlike figure, or the work of a human, or elf, or something else? Asuna was pondering a similar topic within the bath. When she spoke, there was bubbling filter that applied to her voice. By the way, it doesn't seem like there's much in the way of gods in this story. When I read and watched fantasy novels as a little girl, there were always a bunch of different gods with fancy names. You may have a point there. There are churches in bigger towns and NPCs and priests. But I don't even know what god they're worshipping. Then again, it might actually be fitting based on the most fantasy-themed games. All they have is vague godlike figures. Because the player is supposed to fill in the blank for herself? Then I guess your god must be a god of a last attack bonus, as you managed to win yourself the bonus from against today's field boss, after all. I tried to answer her half-joking response with another of my increasingly weak excuses. It's not like I'm going to go out of my way to win them. I just play a character build that excels in attack power, which happens to raise the chance that I'll get the last hit. Besides, if we're talking about gods, then yours must be the god of Bath or something. It ensures that everywhere you go, you find lodgings with baths attached. In fact, that reminds me of the place back in Tolbana. A ball of water smacked the other side of the tent wall behind my head. I remembered that I was supposed to have erased that memory and hastily changed the topic. Anyway, aside from us, it looks like Lind and the DKB are working on the campaign quest. Seems like a waste, especially since Argo put up Volume 1 of her Elf War Strategy Guide. And we added a lot of information on our own, but maybe everyone saw that guide and got a bit intimidated? I mean, it said right there the campaign doesn't end until the 9th floor. Even Agile said, I don't think I've got enough time to mess around with a long-ass quest like that. I snorted with her surprisingly accurate impression of agile. Well, I guess there's always the option. Once we reach the ninth floor, of rushing back here to blaze through it all the entire quest line. Plus, you're a much higher level, so it'll probably give you a better chance of saving the elf companion on the first duel, I noted, then realized something. Challenging a campaign quest that spanned several floors was predicted upon the player's assumption that we'd make it to the ninth floor anyway. I had gotten that far in the beta test, and I hadn't been thinking about leveling since we started the quest. But at the present moment, the ninth floor seemed like a distant fantasy, a future too difficult to fathom at our current rate. Once you started looking up, you had to think about the fact that there were 97 floors above our heads. But you know what? Asuna started from within the tent. As though reading my mind, there was a heavy splash and the sound of wet feet slapping against the wood deck. I heard her sit down right the other side of the heavy hanging flap. She continued, "It's not as scary as it used to be. To think about all the floors left. I'm still trying my hardest to survive each and every day. But now, I'm looking forward to see the Dark Elf's Queen's Place, for example. If the dozen of floors ahead of us were all ripped from the surface centuries ago, then there must be all kinds of sights, sounds, and experiences. It's more of a feeling of anticipation." "I see," I responded simply, impressed once again with Asuna's strength of spirit. It seemed like an inadequate statement, so I searched for something else to add. "I bet there are all kinds of baths up there, too." A sharp elbow, I think, slammed into the small of my back through the heavy tent wall. Sunday, December 18th. 3 days had passed since the first strategy meeting in Zumfut. We hadn't returned to the small town since then, but stuck to the Dark Elf camp, completing quests, collecting upgrade materials, and buffing our skills to earn mods. With a fresh new level gained, I was at 16, and Asuna was at 15. This was probably as far as we'd get here on the third floor. During the beta, the recommended level for fighting the boss was 3 times the floor number, which would probably change as we got further into the game, and we were already half a dozen over that number. Accordingly, the experience we were receiving dropped precariously. Killing mobs in the forest and dungeons barely moved the XP bar in the least. More surprising was that Kismo actually earned a level up from 216 during our journeys together. I actually congratulated her on her level up when I saw the customary flash, but she already interpreted the number as some kind of sword rank, and I did nothing self-aware to thank me. With the help of our even stronger knight companion, the campaign quest proceeded smoothly, but Asuna had noted earlier that we didn't really learn any more about the birth of Aincrad than before. After the Jade Key, the Vanishing Spiders, the third act of the campaign was a collection quest titled The Flower Offering, in which we gathered items to offer to the memory of the slain scout from the previous quest. The fourth act, Emergency Orders, was another search for a missing scout, but unlike the second quest, we successfully rescued the elf this time. But the fifth quest, The Missing Soldier, revealed that the scout we brought back to the camp was none other than the forest elf using a disguise charm. I knew how it all went already. Of course, I was considering whether or not to expose the imposter during the fourth quest, but not only did I not know how to undo his charm, there was also the possibility that the campaign might fall off completely, the tracks, and then right there. I kept an eye out for him as we got back to the base, and then raised an alarm after he tried to steal back the Jade Key from the commander's tent, but I soon lost sight of him, thanks to his elven hiding abilities. It was better than in the beta when the key was stolen from under my nose, but the imposter still had to be chased. We formed a temporary party with the dark elven wolf handlers plus Kismel and followed the imposter's scout tracks directly to a large forest elfin camp. It was at this point that we had to pause the quest, for earlier that day was the battle against the field boss that guarded the cave leading to the labyrinth. We defeated the boss on the first attempt, with no fatalities. Aside from the outcast beater jumping in and stealing the last attack bonus again, it was a rousing success. But I couldn't help but feel that the sparks of anger that had been smoldering within the group were rapidly turning into a raging fire with the creation of two big guilds. "Hey, Asuna!" I shouted into the tent, rubbing the sore spot on my back. The only answer I got was the sound of the exit flap being lifted. I turned to see a slender silhouette leaving the tent, profiled against the dying light. She was in the water for just a minute before, but the leather tunic-clad figure showed no signs of having just bathed. One of the convenient things about virtual bathing was the instant drying effect, but the most vocal bathing admirer in the front line, you'd think Asuna would not like the deviation from realism. Thanks to this mental diversion, the question that eventually left my lips was not what I meant to ask. "Do you ever feel like changing outfits?" Even the dim light, the furious crevice between her eyebrows, was clear as day. "Is there a problem with me not changing?" she snapped, voice freezing cold. I rapidly shook my head back and forth. No problem at all. I just wondered if you felt like wearing something that fit the mood better once you were done bathing. You know, like a yukata or a bathrobe or a single t-shirt." Too late to stop the words. I decided to blame the last option on my subconscious, bringing up what my little sister always wore after a bath. But Asuna held it in. It did nothing worse than twitch her eyelids after a few moments. She looked down at herself and sighed. "As I'm sure you remember, I do have extra outfits. In fact, most of my storage space is packed with them." I did remember. When I had forced her to use the materialize all items command in Urbis so she could retrieve the sword that had been swindled from her, the room had exploded with small, frilly white articles of clothing. Asuna pinned me with a sharp gaze to ensure I didn't remember too many of those details, and leaned against the tent for support, and stared up at the night sky. "But those clothes aren't meant for my own enjoyment." "Huh? Why did you buy so many of them then?" "I didn't." I blinked in surprise, then understood. Many copies of the crafted items often represents a mean, not a purpose. "Are you saying you crafted those yourself to raise your tailoring skill?" I asked softly. Asuna nodded. "But when did you do all of this? It wasn't after we teamed up on the second floor, right?" "No, it was before. You know, when you have to farm monsters on the second floor, you end up with tons of wool and cotton items. I just decided to use them on a whim." "Gotcha. I usually just sell them to an NPC once I get a big stock of them. I'm surprised you were in the mood to work on your crafting skill. Isn't it boring?" For some reason, she did not react. After watching her stand silently, I noticed something. At present, it wasn't the length of time that was the issue with crafting skills. It was the number of slots. At level 1, a player started with 2 skill slots. It expanded to 3 at level 6, 4 at 12, and 5 at 20. From that point on, every 10 levels provided a new slot, as far as I knew. At level 16, I had 4 slots, and they were all filled with battle skills. One-handed sword, martial arts, search, hiding. Asuna had 4 slots as well, but I realized I'd never asked her what her skills she was using, aside from rapier. She wore a metal armor, but the other 2 were a mystery. If one of them was tailoring, why would she choose that? Asuna claimed that she did get rid of the materials, but skill slots were crucially important factors in character build, not something to be chosen on a whim. As a frontline player, it made much more sense to ditch crafting skills to maximize her battle potential and survivability with hiding or search like me, or perhaps acrobatics or weight limit expansion. Asuna didn't need me to explain these things to her. She understood the logic. Asuna seemed to recognize the confusion of my gaze. She glanced at me, looked down, and caught me by surprise once again. "Just so you know, I removed the tailoring from my slot, and most of the clothes are turned back into fabric." "Really? So it was just all a whim, nothing more?" "That's what I said, isn't it? But that's not all there was to it." "Meaning?" "It was a secret. I'll tell you someday if I feel like it." There seemed to be a hint of a smile, that standoffish answer. Asuna pulled off the tent pole. "So, What about you? If you want to take a bath, I'll stand guard here. That won't be necessary. It'll only take me 3 minutes. You go ahead to the dining hall. Okay. While we're eating, you better tell me what you got out of that giant spider today. Yeah, I replied, getting to my feet. Asuna waved and marched off to the nearby dining tent. I watched her go, then stepped through the hanging door of the tent. For the last 5 days, we'd made practice of beelining for this bathing tent when we returned to the camp, and I would stand guard at the entrance while Asuna bathed. At no point in any of this had a dark elf of either sex attempted to visit the tent while someone was inside. It felt like standing guard wasn't even necessary, but it was hard to get over the idea when the only thing separating you from anyone else was a simple flap of fabric. On the other hand, a man had little use for a bath place security. I stepped onto the wooden deck installed within the tent and hit remove button 3 times to all my equipment mannequin, sending all my gear into storage. I shrank back into the immediate chill and headed straight to the large bathtub at the rear of the tent. If it weren't for the fear of the dark elves might be drawn by the sound, I would have leaped into the water. Instead, I slipped gracefully as I could manage. The bathtub was at least 7 or 8 feet long. Heating that much water seemed like it would be hard, but it was just another elven charm at work. The water was pale green color, brimming with pleasant scent like mint or cypress. Once I had up to my shoulders, I felt delightful heat pressure enveloping every inch of my skin. It made sense that Asuna had such a fixation on bathing, but it was so distracting to notice the ways it didn't match up to the real thing. Something about it just didn't feel quite liquidy enough. In the general sense, did my best not to think about my body and everything else in Aincrad being polygonal creations. I was afraid that I might have imagined being faked, that my subconscious might think that this didn't matter, that I could always retry any mistakes. The fighting, eating, sleeping were certainly realistic enough, but there were times when cracks in the edifice would be noticeable. That must have been why I never took to bathing much. But no, that wasn't an excuse. Even in the real world, I wasn't much of a bather as a little kid. Maybe the baths here were actually more suited to me, given that I didn't need any shampoo for my hair scrub or my body to dry off. Small pots filled with what I assumed was shampoo and soap were lined at the edge of the deck, but I never used them. Perhaps Asuna was using them to gain some kind of statistical advantage. Was that the kind of question it was safe to ask? 2 minutes had passed. I stood up and finished my brief bath. I walked outside and saw Kismel waiting for me. The death of Kismel's sister and the very war between the forest and dark elves were nothing more than background setting that had been applied to Kismel. It was impossible to imagine NPCs going about their routines and actually fighting and dying in combat where no player could see. It was the old quandary about the sound of the tree falling alone in the forest. The memories that Kismel spoke at the graveyard to the rear of the camp had been manufactured for her sake. But could I truly guarantee that my memories of 14 years and 72 days were all true? What if my existence was just like Kismel and had been loaded on the first day of Sword Art Online, with all my memories of the real world being nothing but fiction? How could I know that wasn't the case? I wasn't truly grappling with that line of thought, but there was a part of me that wanted to consider my memories and Kismel memories to be fundamentally equal. My thoughts raced through these philosophical topics. I have been plagued by dreams as of late, Kismel suddenly said. Dreams? Though I didn't say it aloud, I was shocked by the idea of an NPC having a dream. What kind? I asked. Well, I believe they are dreams about the time you came to my aid, and I was fighting the forest elf 4 days ago. The strange thing is, what happens next is totally unlike what really happened. First, you are dressed differently, and your partner is not the same. It is not Asuna, but a group of unfamiliar men. Oh, strange. I haven't been in a party group with anyone other than Austin in ages. Yes, but those are more subtle differences. In the dream, you are and your companions fight me against the forest elf. But if you overlook my rudeness, your skills are not what they are now. We cannot stand firm against the forest elf. One falls, then another, and in order to save your lives, I unleash all the protections on the holy tree, which gives elven kind life. The enemy is slain, but I perish as well. I fall on the ground, and you look down upon me with sadness in your eyes. Every time I have that dream, your clothes, your companions are different, but your face is always the same in the end. Ah, I murmured. Then my eyes went wide. I silently gaped. What, that dream? Was it the memories of the SAO beta test? I was so shocked, I nearly asked Kismel this question, knowing she couldn't possibly understand it. Perhaps Kismel did possess the memories of the beta within her. I was fascinated and deeply curious, but I felt I needed to process information before I knew what to ask her. She muttered, "Yes, I would like to know what that dream means." I felt like she was talking more to herself than me. 11:45 at night. My eyes popped open at an alarm that only I could hear, and I waited for my senses to fully return before sitting up. The lamp hanging off the center pole of the tent and the fires in the heater were both extinguished, but there was enough moonlight coming through the exhaust vent of the roof to see by. In the center of the pelt-covered floor, Kismel and Asuna lay close together, fast asleep. NPCs acted like players in that they went to sleep at night, but in their case, they simply closed their eyes and went inactive, according to the rules of their programming. At least, that's what I'd always assumed, and perhaps it was true for NPCs other than Kismel. But 6 hours ago, she told me that she had a mysterious dream every night. At that point, the possibility that someone in real world could be role-playing as the Dark Elf Knight disappeared entirely. Bringing up the topic of the beta test destroyed the illusion of a simple NPC, and my appearance now was completely different from the beta days. Someone had on development side would know that, and they wouldn't say something like, "Your face is always the same" at the end. So, assuming Kismel was a true NPC, what did that dream mean to her? The function of the dream was still largely unexplained, as was still active in calculating her process as slept. I challenged the Jade Key quest 3 times in the beta, and I remember seeing her die in each case. Was that data accumulating in her system, and her program was simply trying to find some logic up to this memory that should not exist? Did she remember the beta because she was an exceptional NPC? Or had she gained her exceptional nature because those memories still existed within her? A gentle night breeze through the gaps of the entrance flap ruffled my hair. I recalled the day this game of death began. I left my first and only friend, Klein, back in the town of beginnings, and raced through the open fields, and didn't stop until I reached the village of Horunka, deep in the forest. I was heading straight for the quest that would reward me with my Neelblade, the weapon I still use today. The quest was offered by a mother of a sickly child, and required me to hunt plant monsters for a special herb. In the midst of that quest, I ran across the former beta tester for the first time. He invited me into a party, and when we'd collected enough herbs for one of us to turn the quest, he tried to kill me with a monster trap. Instead, I just barely survived, and returned to the village to give the mother her herbs. When I did the same quest in the beta, I took my sword and raced off to the next place of interest. But for some reason, this time, I watched her prepare the medicine, and followed her into the child's room next door. As I watched the sick little child, the NPC named Agatha, slowly recover thanks to the potion. I recalled how I had cared for my sister when she was sickly. The emotions that had been building up inside me since I learned that I was trapped in a game of death suddenly burst forth, and I wept into the blankets of the bed. Agatha reached over, looking concerned, and rubbed my head over and over until I stopped. I took another deep breath and pushed the memories out of my mind. Kismel and Asuna were lined up together, fast asleep like sisters. After bathing and eating, we went back out to the forest and with Kismel's help, completed all the quests we picked up in Zimfoot. We'd have to turn them in later, but after a solid 4 hours of fighting spiders, tree ants, and wolves, they must have been exhausted. Didn't NPCs even have a fatigue stat, though? I could have stood to sleep some more myself, but there was another mission to be undertaken tonight. I crawled along the floor, slipping out of the entrance with minimum disturbance, and took another deep breath. That lungful of crisp, cold air shook me fully awake, and I snuck away through the night camp and passed by the now familiar night guards with a wave and headed through the canyon into the forest for the third time today. The forest of wavering mists was dangerous at night. When the heavy mists rolled in, there was nothing to see but a blue-gray haze. I had a solid grasp of the terrain now, though I proceeded through the forest, mindful of the precedence of monsters, and less than 10 minutes I reached a familiar staircase leading back down to the second floor. Bathed in pale moonlight, the stone structure appeared to be empty, but as I drew nearer, a silhouette melted out of the otherwise thin air of shadow of one of the pillars. This player's hiding skill was on par with Kismel's and her cloak of invisibility. The person I was meeting grinned, painted whiskers crinkling beneath her heavy hood.
7 seconds late, key boy.
Sorry, blame it on the train driver. Her hood shook ruefully at my earnest attempt at humor.
I can sell you some better jokes if you're looking to improve.
No thanks, I'll manage with what I've got. I hate to rush you, but did you learn anything about what I asked for?
Always the impatient one you are. The hastiest rats are the ones that don't make it back to the hole.
My grinning quest hopped up to the collapsed pillar nearby her crossed legs. I took up a position, leaning against the pillar, facing her. Argo the Rat was the first and best information dealer agent in Aincrad. I'd known her for a long time. If a month counted as long, but I barely knew anything about her personally. I was pretty sure she was a girl, pretty sure she was somewhere between her late teens and early 20s, and pretty sure she was also a beta tester. She collected information from her beta experience, as well as nuggets bought from me and other testers, and compiled them into her own series of strategy guides that she sold through NPC item shops throughout the game. Most important of all to remember is her motto: any information with a price would be sold. That meant that if I asked Argo to sell me personal information like her height, weight, favorite food, skill layout, and so on, she would do it, as long as I paid the price. Fortunately, the cost of information I wanted in this case was quite reasonable. I pulled 500 coal out of my coat pocket and flipped it to her, which she caught nimbly between her two fingers. The coin danced along her fingers before disappearing entirely.
Thanky. I'll tell you what I know so far.
Her grin on her whiskers disappeared, and she continued with a low voice.
Seems like there is only one player who joined with Lin Dragon Knights Brigade since reaching the 3rd floor. His name's Morchi. He uses a one-hand sword skill, and he never takes off his metal coif, even in town. That's all I've got for ya.
Morchi, I repeated, thinking that it sounded like a type of candy. A man wearing a coif. That had to be the man I saw Lynn's team of 5 the other day. He was probably a beta tester like me, and was feeding Lynn information on the campaign quest. Suddenly, I recognized the contradiction there. Wait, but at the last strategy meeting, which I assume you were watching, the DKB had 18 members, the same during the last boss fight. So if Morchi joined, does that mean one person dropped out? And was it voluntary or forced? Argo waved my suspicion away.
Nope. The 18 at the meeting were the same from the boss battle.
Do you know all the names of the faces of the DKB?
I wouldn't be much of an informant if I didn't. Same goes for the ALS.
It was silly for me to ask, I said, raising my hands in surrender. So, Mort just joined up to the 3rd floor and wasn't present at the meeting? And the reason for that is
mystery to me. Afraid to say.
You'd have to ask him or Lynn to know, I guess. I played back my recollection of the strategy meeting in Zumpf 3 days ago, but I couldn't remember the faces of the other 17 dressed in blue. Part of it was that I sat at the very top row of the stadium-style seating, so I could only see the backs of the others present. And halfway through the meeting, most of my mind power was spent worrying about the imminent explosion of anger from Asuna. Still, it had to be the problem that 40 days after this game started, we were still putting our lives in the hands of other players whose names or faces we couldn't even recall. I wasn't going to get into the business of selling information anytime soon, but it wouldn't be a bad idea for more effort into remembering people. It just wasn't a skill that came naturally to me. I asked Argo, so how did this Mort character get into the guild?
Looks like he requested to join. The day after the 3rd floor opened up, Lind introduced him as the new recruit to the other main members of the DKB guild. Well, technically, it wasn't a guild yet at that point.
So it was Lind who took his request directly. I'm surprised that Lind would just rubber stamp him like that. Maybe Mort was just that powerful. How does he seem to you? It was just an idle, curious question. Argo grimaced atop the stone pillar and rocked back and forth.
The thing is, I haven't seen this Mort fellow for myself yet. I stalked him out of the pub at the DKB was using the base in Sumfoot, but I haven't seen anyone who matches the description.
Wow. Even if you can't stop him, he must be trying to hide himself.
That's what I think. If it's Lynn's orders, then perhaps he's supposed to be a secret weapon to help them jump past the ALS. I'm sure he'll be involved in the boss battle, so at the very least, I'll check him out there.
Please do. Well, I've certainly gotten my money's worth in info here.
Glad to hear it.
Argo grinned. She hopped off the 5-foot-tall pillar without a sound and raised her hand to her face. The coin I'd paid her just a minute ago was there in her fingertips, glinting in the moonlight.
By the way, Keyboy, any interest in selling some intel?
Oh, what kind?
Like where you've been staying with A-chan since we've got here.
Not selling that, I replied immediately. Argo grinned again.
I see. You didn't immediately deny you were lodging with her. Don't worry, I won't go selling that juicy nugget.